Popcorn, 1991. Buy a bag, go home in a box. I've been so waiting to see this movie, and if you consider the golden age of slasher from 1978 to 1984, and then obviously the momentum of that craze carried on throughout the rest of the decade of the 80s and on into the early 90s. So even though this came out in 1991, it's still kind of stuck in the 80s feel. I really like this movie. I'm glad I checked it out finally. It stars Jill Schoelen, who looks like Jessie J in this. She has that haircut in it. I consider this almost the last symbolic slasher movie of that Silver Age era of slasher movies, and I could see why that it gets remembered and talked about still by horror fans. Because you don't hear a lot of other early 90s slasher movies that get talked about. The concept, I'm going to explain. The simple concept is basically it's kind of a mashup of like House of Wax, Phantom of the Opera, and like the Stabathon from Scream 4, where they have the horror movie marathon of stab films. So basically this film class is having a fundraiser one night only, resurrecting the town theater. You know, those old movie theaters with double story. I've watched movies in a few of those. They're really nice to watch, those old movie theaters that are classy. And basically there's a phantom-like figure in it killing off the film students throughout the film. So if that sounds like a dope concept, I recommend you checking it out. And so the main girl, like I was saying, is Jill Schoelen, was basically the Neve Campbell or Katie Cassidy of the late 80s, early 90s. She was in The Phantom of the Opera, The Stepfather, Cutting Class, 1989, which is another slasher movie that I just checked out and rented the other day. And obviously she was always also in Popcorn and in When a Stranger Calls Back, 1993. So, and then when they're cleaning up the film, you see them dressing up and they show some old horror film, and they make a lot of references to old 50s horror movies and even non-horror movies, a lot of pop culture references. And they find an old film reel and they decide to play it, and they discover that it was based on the old legend of this guy who filmed his own snuff film, which is where you actually kill someone in your movie. Kind of like how Cannibal Holocaust has rumors of being a snuff film, and they are out there. And so that's how it plays out. So they think that that's the phantom figure killing off of them, but only the main girl believes it, of course, throughout the whole night. And that's basically my non-spoiler review so far, and a few other non-spoiler things. The people all dressed up in masks who came to the horror movie marathon, and they did it basically, the movies that they played were 50s style B movies, monster movies, you know, except for they were knockoffs. They were like films within films. They filmed them themselves, you know, and so that took away from it. I didn't really like that. You could tell that it was filmed in the 90s instead of the 50s. I'm sure they could have got some free domain movies to play in their movie. So that took a little bit away from it. Then the people all in the crowd and all the extras, they dressed up in different masks. That was interesting to see. And also the mosquito prop death. They're playing a 50s, you know, those 50 monster movies where there'll be like a tarantula, where the tarantula is like huge and blown up on the screen. Well, they played a mosquito movie spoof of that, and they did this gliding like mosquito prop that came down, and lo and behold, the phantom figure, Phantom of the Opera style, except for this not being a chandelier, this was the mosquito, and he ends up killing the teacher Mr. Davis in that scene. Awesome. Love that scene. And the killer goes around making masks, you know, just how the Phantom of the Opera is disfigured. So is this one disfigured. The villain in this. And he's making masks throughout the film, so you get to see that. That's dope. And then the girl ends up making out with the killer who's wearing the mask, and it starts coming apart. Because the killer's like making a mask of like the different film students to pose as them. It's pretty dope. And so then this girl starts making out with him, and it starts coming off real sick 80s kind of style. Prop with the latex melting off. That scene is so fucking dope. And then he ends up killing her. And what he ends up doing is another one of the film students ends up looking for her and asking her questions. And he holds up the body like a head on a stick. Wolf Creek style. And he starts talking with it like a puppet. It's freaking dope. And the crowd is really overly happy for being there and seeing all these shitty movies. I don't know why. It was like 3 different movies and they were all freaking terrible. And they were all just joyous, clapping, all in between. Then out of nowhere, the movie shuts off and they put a reggae band onto it, and then it turns into a concert, and they're even more happy when they see that. They went there to go and see 50s B horror movies and sci-fi movies, and it ends up turning into a reggae band. Okay, so then I did research and I saw it was filmed in Kingston, Jamaica, which is kind of a shock. But then that made more sense why the band was there. So I was like, okay. And so now I'm going to get to the ending. I recommend watching it. It's on YouTube. Go and check it out. And so there becomes a twist ending. Instead of it being Jill's father and her being his daughter of the director that burned down the place, instead, it was a victim, Toby, who's in the film class. You gotta have a twist ending. And this one was pretty great. And once he's revealed and he shows her the different mechanisms of how he's been wearing a mask to cope with the disfigurement of he was a guest at the showing 15 years earlier, and her aunt was involved. I don't know how she was involved, but basically he got disfigured from the fire, and he's been holding that grudge, and he's living out, and he decided to live out what the scene was of killing his family in front of the stage. So he tries to kill Jill Schoelen's character, and I know a lot of people have a hard-on for her. They gotta have a hard-on for her since she was a really popular actress in the late 80s, early 90s. And then the film kind of goes downhill from there. I thought it would have been more dramatic ending, but they reveal the killer like with 20 minutes still left in the movie. So then it kind of little sags after his introduction and his little speech of why he's crazy and a maniac and his motives, which are just classic scenes by Tom Villard, a guy who died from AIDS apparently, that I read on the research. And then he sets it up, and then the crowd thinks it's real or it's fake. And then they do a comic relief ending and then a happy ending, even though half the film class died and they're still cracking pop culture jokes. So that's my only downgrade on that. I'm going to give it a B plus for sure. And I can't wait to see it again, to track Toby's movements throughout the whole movie, of him impersonating the different people in the movie. Just great. This was JBM from Villain Radio, Villain News, Mr. Creepshow 09. Definitely check out my horror movies coming up. I'm going to do Sorority House Massacre 2, The Haunting on Sorority Row, and Cry Wolf coming up on Back to School Week, September 2012.